Turn with me, if you will, to what I'm sure is probably a text you've memorized many times. 2 Samuel chapter 8, where the writer writes, "In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought tribute. Moreover, David fought Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, where he went to restore his control along when he went to restore his control along the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstringed all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 20,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tabah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tau, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tau. Joram brought him articles of silver and gold and bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and the gold from the nations he had subdued: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and the Amalekites. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Zadok, son of Ahab, and Elimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. You try to pronounce those names. I thought I did well till we got to verse 17. Sariath was the secretary. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Karahites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were royal advisors. You all got that text memorized, right? Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you keep eye on what we do. And may what we do be able to be found in agreement with what the description is of David, that we did what is just and right for others. May we learn the lesson of David as we continue to try to be people who are faithful for you. And may we be reminded that no matter how good we are, there's still something greater we need. And it's in your Son Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As we move into the next phase of the life of David, David is now the king of Israel. And you get to a text like chapter 8 with the names that I don't know and the cities that are just a map to most of us. But you look at the greatness of what David has done, or the goodness for the people that David has done. And the text makes it very clear after reading through the accounts of 1 Samuel and what the world and what the nation looked like under the reign of King Saul, that David is a good king. David is a very good king. Saul basically played defense while David goes on offense as the king of the land. Listen to all those nations and all those tribes that David fought. In my office, there are 2 pieces of Civil War memorabilia or souvenirs. Nothing like some people I know. Nothing from a battlefield. Nothing that belongs to the federal government. Nothing that was used at the time. But on my desk is a paperweight of the monument to the state of Virginia, found at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is basically a statue of General Robert E. Lee, which looks across the battlefield to the statue of General Meade, if you're ever there. And back on the little table behind, amongst all the bobbleheads and the Star Wars and the Star Trek and all the other nonsense back there, you'll find next to a wood piece of the church from the fictional town of Mayberry, you'll see a statue or a little structure of the Dunker Church found on the battlefield at Antietam. Those are the battles from the fall of 1862 into the summer of 1863 in the Civil War. Those were the battles that were most concerning to President Lincoln, because for the first time, General Lee had brought his forces into Union territory. Because Lee understood what David understood. Sometimes you have to go on the offense in the battle, not just for the sake of trying to defeat the enemy. But the reason, when you take the battle out of your border, you also take the army out of your border. So when David starts to go on the attack, instead of like Saul just trying to fight off people who come in, he doesn't have to worry about enemy soldiers that are requisitioning people's homes or eating the citizens of his land's food. In fact, on the other hand, you get to go into the invading land and take their resources. Which, if you're an Israelite who has spent the last few years under the reign of Saul, just waiting to see which army is going to come into town next and salt your field, or take the crops out of your field, or tell you that you need to make sure they have housing for the night, you're definitely talking about the fame of King David when he goes on the attack and takes out these other folk. David not only does that, but in chapter 5, we're told that David moves just from a kind of a desert capital to a capital that becomes a city on the hill. In fact, the city on the hill. As he goes, according to 2 Samuel chapter 5, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. David moves the capital to Jerusalem, the city of peace, the city of promise. That's a good king. And we have the description of David's kingdom in that summary verse we read in our text this morning. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 15. David reigned over all Israel. And what kind of king is he? He's the one who was doing what was not just, was doing the stuff that was just and right for the people. As opposed to the last king, who, as his whim came about, and as he battled the issues of depression and possibly demonic oppression, depending on what it means that the Lord sent a spirit, or at least confusion and misunderstanding, and you had to deal with whatever his mood was that day, David is seen as a king who does what is right. This is the summary of the law, to love your neighbor as yourself, which goes along with loving God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, and your spirit. Soul and strength. David shows us. How does he take care of his people? He protects his land. He moves his capital from a place of little strength to a place where the Jebusites say, if you can possess this mountain, if you can get to Jerusalem, even our lame and blind can defend this place. And he does what's right for his people. David's a good king. The text makes a wonderful story out of how good a King David is. And before we get too concerned about the fact that David seems to be too good, the text throws in a few other things without commentary. It just records them. Chapter 5, verse 13. After David left Hebron and moved the capital to Jerusalem, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Wait, did that say more wives, plural? Well, yeah. David was already married first to the daughter of Saul by the name of Michal. After the concept of the first arranged marriage was decided that wasn't a good idea. So Saul's second daughter's in love with him. Saul marries David off to her. Then when David goes on the run, it's a part of the story we don't talk about. David sends Michal off and marries her to another man. Well, he then marries 5 other women while he's living in the desert and in exile. Then he brings Michal back, so he's got 6 wives before he goes to Jerusalem. And the implication here is we're not done capturing them. Now, I'm not exactly sure that's a moral example we want to follow. Anybody else want to disagree with that? This is often the part where people want to attack our faith and say, now wait a minute, you guys want to talk about the sanctity of marriage and the holiness of marriage, and here's this guy that the text says has a heart for God, and he's got multiple wives and multiple concubines, and when he gets to the capital city, after you said he's a good king, he's going to add even more women into this story. Come back next week and the week after. And watch it, while the text does not condemn him for it, the text does talk about the consequences of these activities. Next week, we'll look at what happens when he brings one of those wives in and the aftermath that comes about as a result of that. And then, as we get close to concluding this series, we'll look at what happens when you have a household that looks this diverse and the kind of consequences that can come from it. In the next chapter, chapter 6, we have the story where David has finally liberated the Ark of the Covenant that has been in the captivity of the Philistines. And in his haste, and in his lack of following the restrictions and the commands of how the Ark is to be moved, instead of taking the consecrated men who have the correct poles that go into the side, the loops on the side, and they carry the Ark. Even the Nazis in Raiders of the Lost Ark understood how to carry the Ark properly. But David apparently doesn't. And yes, I'm fully aware that one of those is a fictional film. Don't worry, I know. I'm just making a point. In David's haste, as he tells them, just load it on a flatbed and get that thing here. It was a flatbed, it was a flat cart. We have the fact that a man dies as a result of the mishandling. So while David is good, David's not perfect. Which I think, as we talk about the concept of what does faith look like, is sometimes the story we need to remind ourselves. The one the text says is a man whom God sees something in it that he follows and desires to be all that he's supposed to be. He still is a sinful man who needs something greater than himself. Because there's the point where we can make our heroes in the faith so wonderful and so marvelous that they do not give us a contemporary to be compared to, but one who can only keep us scared that we can never measure up. A few months ago now, Don and I had a conversation at 7 o'clock in the morning, which is one of the things that happens around here when you're the only 2 people standing around the coffee pot. There's a movie out called The Ragamuffin, which is the story of Rich Mullins. And that name may sound familiar to you. I know that you're familiar at least with his song, Awesome God, because we sing it here quite often. Rich to me is just a name of a guy in a book and his music book, and I've seen a few of the videos and those kind of things. I also knew that he was for a short time an alumnus of the Bible college of which I went to, and I also know that it was kind of a tumultuous time when he was there because he was kind of an iconoclast. He was the kind of guy that just would do enough things to keep the administration not real thrilled and excited that he was around. Don, on the other hand, knew him quite better than I, because Don knew him as another person living in the dormitory with him. But when Don saw this movie, it depressed him and broke his heart because the movie paints a more realistic picture of the life that Rich lived. It showed the fact that Rich struggled with alcoholism, with lust, with what happens when you go beyond lust. And Dom's like, I don't know why they had to put that in the movie. Why couldn't they have just, had that nice Disney kind of feeling to the movie, You know the Disney character who, even when their worst moment, they're not all that bad? You know what I'm talking about? Where everybody is just too squeaky clean. I'm really thinking more of like those 60s style movies. The Shaggy Dog and Flubber. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a Fred McMurray, that's the right name. The Fred McMurray character is always just so squeaky clean. But the truth is, Rich Mullins himself understood he was a ragamuffin. He understood this truth that we learn of David. David may be a good king. David may be faithful in many ways, but that does not make David perfect. The story of David is a story of hope for us as well. God can use us to do some mighty and wonderful things, not because of how good we are, but in spite of how good we are. And maybe it's when we recognize and realize this, that like David, we can begin to treat people the way we wish to be treated. Because while we alluded to it this week, I'm going to look at it a little bit more closely, briefly this morning. David, in this account, in these chapters from 5 to 10, is not just a good king, he's a graceful king. David has taken over Jerusalem. He's fighting these battles. He's increasing and protecting the border. And chapter 9 says this. David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul? Well, if we stop there with the question, the next answer is, because if there is, we must eradicate and eliminate them. That's the normal way a Mideastern king takes care of things here in the early 9th, 10th century BC. This is the concept. You take the threats out. You eliminate the threat. If you have taken over a land, the last people you want around are the family of the last regime. Because those are the kind of folk who can lead an army, lead a rebellion, and overthrow you. Now I know I just said Jerusalem is this wonderful fortified city, and we may picture it as the tourist area that it is now, or the place of the first century in the time of Jesus, where the Romans made it the capital of their area. In this period of time, it's basically just a dusty, dirty kind of town on top of a hill. It has not grown into that yet. The Jebusites were not really known as the great civilization builders of the Bronze and Iron Age. So it's not like David is this guy. Think of Washington, D.C. when they were building the White House, when it truly was a swamp. You know, those stories of Adams and Jefferson and Madison where, it's more likely you're going to die of malaria than you are going to get a bill passed in the city. It's kind of like that. So it's in this power, it would not be difficult for a group of people to decide they'll ally with David, but they're really allied still with Saul's family and take him out. So the answer in any other conversation would be, we got to go find Saul's family. And we got to take him out. Instead, as you can already see, because the verse is behind my back and you've already read it 9 times, would he move on? Instead, he says what? Is there anyone whom I can show kindness because they deserved it? Because they've earned my kindness? No. For Jonathan's sake. Anybody in Saul's family left around. Doesn't have to be Jonathan's son. It is Jonathan's son. But because of the love for Jonathan, the promise in chapter 24 to Saul as well, he will show mercy and favor, not because someone earned it, but because he can bestow it. David in this action with this young boy Mephibosheth. Found in chapter 9, where when he finds his nurse, the nurse tells him about the condition and tells him he's more than willing to do whatever you need. He's more than willing to serve as your servant. He's more than willing to serve as your slave. David says he's moving into my home. And the text says, from that day on, he ate at the king's table like one of the king's sons. Because of what he had done? No, because David showed him favor and showed him mercy. Where did David learn that we receive favor and mercy not because we deserved it, but because one who's greater than you can show favor and mercy? Maybe that's a lesson he learned. When, as the youngest of all of Jesse's children, somehow he was the one who was chosen to be king. Maybe as the one who, despite the fact he doesn't necessarily have it completely together morally, he doesn't have it completely together with everything perfect, chapter 8 is still true, that God blessed him in his victories over the enemies of the people. Maybe he knew how to show grace because he had received grace. This good king becomes a graceful king. That's all the background to the one chapter in this section I want us to really, really look at. Let me read from chapter 7. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of the covenant remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "You jumped the gun, pal. Go back, and here's what I want you to tell my servant. This is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any one of the rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people, Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flocks to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you've gone. I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked men will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies." You're going, all right. And now God's going to say, here's the blueprints. This is what I want my temple to look like, right? Well, hold on. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name. Which is a nice way of saying, David, I've taken care of you. I've blessed you. I'm going to make you a great guy. I'm going to let your son be great after you. But you know what? You don't get to build the thing. So don't do it. It's nice. It's all positive. It's all positive. It's all positive. And then you work that negative right there in the middle. Then we continue. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he will be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported this to David, all the words of the entire revelation, and then David prays, thanking God for his kindness and his obedience and willingness to follow. In chapter 7, this is one of the key texts of the Old Testament. As good as David is, God promises that there's someone coming who is greater. This text takes on the nurture of a greater king. It starts innocently. David has built a palace for himself. He has finally successfully sent guys to properly move the ark into town. The ark is found in the tabernacle where it's supposed to be. And David thinks, if I, the king, am no longer living in tents, I'm living in a palace, then God deserves a place to live too, or at least the presence of his ark. And if David is the good king, if David is the one after God's heart, we would all just go ahead and write the story and then David went out and built a glorious temple. And everybody came to see it, and it was wonderful throughout the land. And they all lived happily ever after, right? You get to the point where God just says, no, don't build it. John Davis, in his book on the birth of a kingdom, says there are probably 4 reasons why God says no. Number 1, it's always been a temporary tabernacle. God says, have I ever asked for this? I've been able to go with you. The idea is it's supposed to be a mobile tabernacle. In fact, when the writer of Hebrews speaks of Jesus' sacrifice, he does not have the sacrifice being presented in a temple. Hebrews 9:11, when Christ came as the high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made. That is to say, not a part of this creation. It's quite possible that God's first point is, you know what happens if you build me a temple? People aren't going to think that's the home of my ark. They're not going to just see that as the place you come to take care of the sacrifices and make atonement. They're going to start to think that's where I live. And I'm not a God who dwells in a location. I'm not like the other idols who have their temples where you go there because that's their place of power. I've been in a tabernacle. I've been in a tent. You've been able to move me around. You know why? Because I'm a God who can be anywhere and everywhere. Number 2, this is David's desire. That doesn't make it God's desire. God knows what happens when people only think of him as a location instead of one who's active. Anybody know any people who think of God's activity being limited to a physical location instead of in any other way, shape, or form? Can't imagine that concept. Where we replace the word ecclesia, which becomes church, as the people of God and turn into a location for God. You ever had that person who acts like there's something different about this building but not about the people? Why can't a child run in this building? Why? Because it's what? Not just church, it's God's house. Where did we get that concept? Well, we took it from a temple. We ignored the fact. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul said, do you not know that you yourselves are God's temple? That God's Spirit lives in you? Church buildings can be deconsecrated. People can meet in other places. But if anyone destroys God's temple, his people, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. Maybe God knows if they build me a temple, they're going to start to think that's where I live. They're going to stop thinking of me as the God that I have described and revealed myself as. The other problem may be who David is. David is a warrior, and as a warrior, he has shed blood. In fact, 1 Corinthians indicates that in the answer to David, when the chronicler takes it, 1 Chronicles says that's exactly what came. But the word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood, you have fought many wars, you are not to build a house for my name. God says, I'm okay with the concept of a contractor, but I'm not sure I want the one who's known as the guy who slays thousands and 10,000s. And the reason probably is the 4th reason. David may be thinking of a temple the same way the Philistines did. Remember the text we just read in chapter 8? Where all the plunder and all of those things were dedicated to God? If not, Mike's going to put that text back on the screen behind my head. If you went to a Philistine temple to any of their gods, you know what you would walk through first? You'd walk through the museum of the leader, and all of his war trophies would be there. And that's not the point of my tabernacle. That's not the point of my temple. It's not the David War Memorial before you get to the Holy of Holies. We're not going to build one of those. If you think you're going to dedicate to me all your war trophies, no thank you, sir. So that may be the reasons why. But God, in his graciousness and his mercy, makes a dual promise to David. Number one, you're going to have a son, and he will build the temple. David, your family will get the construction job. They will be responsible for building my temple. And I know we're in the second kingdom of Israel, but there's not going to be a third line of people. This is now the family by which I will work. I'm going to establish your kingdom forever. Now, you may know that when we get to 1 Kings chapter 9, there's a wonderful discussion and story of the day in which King Solomon dedicated the temple. We will learn more about Solomon and his birth in the next few weeks, which means we know that that promise came true. But has anybody got a problem with that second half of the promise? That this kingdom is going to last forever. Let me ask you a question. The leader of the nation of Israel was recently here. Was he in any way known as a king from the line of David? No, he was Prime Minister Netanyahu, right? Does that seem to indicate that maybe something kind of went haywire with this promise? If that's not enough to make you think something went haywire, keep reading through what happens after Solomon builds the temple, because the story kind of moves on pretty quickly. Solomon dies, and guess what? There's a civil war between Solomon's son and some other folk in Israel who think that they should be in charge, and it leaves this kingdom after 2 whole generations of splitting in a civil war in which 10 of the 12 tribes take off and make themselves a new king under a new family. Uh-oh. And if that doesn't concern you, keep reading through 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And when you get to the end of 2 Kings, guess what happens? The Babylonians show up. And they remove the king from the throne altogether. And the whole nation goes into exile, at least for 70 years. And when they come back, guess what the people don't get? There ain't no king, no mo. I believe that's the theological term. Ain't no king, no mo. I believe that's what Israel wrote over its political foundation. Well, then what in the world? God sends the prophet to tell David a lie, just something to make him feel good because he doesn't get to build a temple? Remember when I said they were in exile for maybe 70 years? Matthew chapter 2 speaks of the fact that a cry came out of Ramah as he describes what happened in David's hometown of Bethlehem when King Herod, a pretend king of Israel, takes out the children. And the text uses the imagery of the fact that this is a nation still in exile. But the hope and promise is the one who's not killed in Bethlehem. Solomon is a good king, like his father, but he's not a greater king. Oh, he does some good and better things at times. He does make the nation more prosperous. He does extend the borders a little bit further to what they're supposed to be. But his sins are grave and greater than his father in many ways. It's one of the reasons why the Civil War takes place. The generations that come after him that stay true to the Davidic line in the kingdom of Judah, or the two southern tribes, have good kings and they have bad kings. But the greater king arrives out of the exile. After the 490 years of God's silence, the greater king is the one whom David himself speaks of in Psalm chapter 2, when he begins to have a hope and a promise for someone greater. The greater king, and what makes David so important to us, is his ultimate descendant of the great king, which Paul writes or speaks of in Acts chapter 13. The fact that God raised him from the dead, never to decay, stands in these words from that second psalm. I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. So it is stated elsewhere, you will not let your Holy One see decay. For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, his time as king was over. He fell asleep. He was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not see decay. David becomes significant. Not just because of what he does and how we work through his life story and his psalms of contrition and his psalms of praise, and we see the fact that he treats people justly and he treats them and does what's right for the people. Not just because he shows us an example that when we fail and when we fall, there is still grace to be received and grace to be given. But David's family brings with it the true hope of the entire world. The greater king. The king whose kingdom has no boundary limits, because it moves as people dedicate their lives in obedience to him. The hope and promise is not just of what Solomon did by building that physical temple, but by the one who through his death, burial, and resurrection is able to promise that gift of the indwelling Spirit that makes people the true temple of God. The one who knew that the point of the temple or the tabernacle is that it is a symbol of something greater. The redemption and the hope of mankind. That the true freedom that comes is not from the Amalekites and the Jebusites and the Perizzites and the Parasites and the... One of those is not right. But the true freedom that comes is when the enemies of sin and death can be destroyed and mankind can be truly freed. 2 Samuel 7 becomes one of those great Old Testament passages of hope, along with Genesis chapter 3, where we start to look for God's great king, where it's promised that the seed of the woman shall crush the head of the serpent who works to encourage sin and death. Or the promise to Abraham that his seed will be a blessing for all the peoples of all the world in chapter 12 and chapter 15 of Genesis. Or the one who is the only hope of fulfilling Moses' discussion in Deuteronomy of the prophet who is greater than Moses, whom the writer of Deuteronomy in the postscript writes, no prophet has risen like Moses. Or the one who can fulfill this promise in chapter 7, to be the greater son of David, who brings a kingdom that shall never be abolished. We can be good people. We can be people who can demonstrate gracefulness we have received. But all of it, like the promise to David, is based on this hope and foundation that the greater King not is coming, but has come. We have our hope, our confidence, and our trust in the fact that the great King Jesus has bestowed upon us His grace. And as a result of being the recipients of His grace, then we are able to do good things as a demonstration of our faith that we put in His grace. If today it's your desire to become a part of that kingdom, then we're going to offer an invitation. And if today you're a member of that kingdom, then let us sing in celebration of what God has done for us as we sing our song this morning of invitation. Let's stand for our invitation.